This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 174 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. I'm a huge supporter of professionals taking ownership of their careers, regardless of the systemic issues at play. But having said that, I also like to help educators get to a place where they can work towards addressing systems issues head on. That's why I was so excited to talk with Kurtis Hewson about the collaborative response framework in episode 174 of De Facto Leaders. Kurtis Hewson is an award-winning former administrator and teacher, as well as teaching faculty at the post-secondary level. He is the co-founder of Jigsaw Learning, a co-author of the text Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners, and currently works with districts and schools nationally and internationally, establishing the collaborative response frameworks and interacting with thousands of educators annually. Good teachers, therapists, and administrators often develop toolkits they can use to offer a continuum of support to students. But as Kurtis points out, they're often operating in silos of excellence. So what would happen if team members worked together to pool their resources? We also discuss how people in education talk a lot about the problems with the system, but what exactly is the system and how do we improve it? Is talking about individual student needs always the best use of time at team meetings? Meetings sometimes feel like an obligation or a waste of time. So how do we change that? What types of meetings should district level teams have? And what's the purpose of each? Why should school teams have 4 tiers of support rather than the traditional 3 tiers of response to intervention? If you are a related service provider, you're probably aware of how much collaboration is needed to put executive functioning support in place. So that's why I encourage you, if you enjoy this episode, definitely check out the resources that Kurtis has, including the collaborative response framework. We link to all of those in the show notes. But also, if you want to specifically develop a toolkit of resources and strategies that you can share with your team to support students' executive functioning and also figure out a strategic plan for putting those supports in place. You'll also want to take a look at the School of Clinical Leadership, my program for related service providers, designing intervention for executive functioning. To learn more about the program, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Kurtis Hewson. Today, I am joined by Kurtis Hewson, lead learner and co-founder of Jigsaw Learning. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Karen. Great to see you once again.
Yeah, so I thought we would start off by having you share your backstory your backstory. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do now and how Jigsaw Learning came to be.
Yeah, so I've been an educator for, I think this is 27 years now here in central Alberta, Canada. And when I got into education, I got into it with that aspiration of I just want to make a difference for students. And that has always been the driving mantra, but has taken a path that did not expect when planning out where you go with your next
Mm-hmm.
steps. So
Yeah.
started as an educator, and then really early in my career, I was tapped to move into educational leadership. And I spent over a decade as a assistant principal and principal in a number of schools. It was in the last school in the mid 2000s that I came in as a principal and really started to look at how could we establish really high level collaboration structures and processes in place. I spent 5 years at that school putting the pieces together, and then I moved on and taught at the university level. But it was during that 5 years that I was at that school that we came up with a quite a unique collaborative framework, I guess you would call it. And during that time, began to have other schools asking about it. Started to get requests to come and explain to other schools and other leaders what it was that we had done. I needed to give it language. And at the time, I was also working with my wife, Lorna, around this work. And we referred to it as collaborative response and started to explain it to others. And it just continued to organically grow here within our province and then beyond. So it was about 2016 that I moved full-time into our business, Jigsaw Learning, to be able to do this full-time with schools and with districts. A year and a half later, my wife moved in full-time, and it's now what we do. We support schools and more primarily school districts now
Mm-hmm.
in establishing what we refer to as collaborative response, some really specific structures and processes that schools implement with the idea that we're going to respond to the needs of all students, but doing it in a way that's always building capacity of the team. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of that short journey. It was not what set out to do when first becoming an educator. But going back to that, I just want to make a difference for students. That's been the driving mantra all along, and it's really valuable now to be able to think that the work that is happening is making a difference for thousands upon thousands of students with the numbers of schools and districts that are implementing the collaborative response framework here, not only within our own province of Alberta, but Canada, the US, Iceland, Australia, and beyond.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'd love to, I know we're going to talk about all the different pieces of what the
Hmm.
framework is today, but I remember in a previous conversation, one of the things that you mentioned was just this idea of when we think about supporting students who need additional help, a lot
Hmm.
of times we start with within RTI, we're thinking about tier three. How do we
Hmm.
help those students who are struggling, who need something above and beyond the regular or the general education curriculum? But I know that that isn't always the most effective way, depending on the district, of course. But how do you think about that when if you go into a school or a district and there are a lot of students that need supplemental supports? Where do you think about starting as far as I know that there's all the systems and structures, but as far as what tier you want to think about first?
Yeah. So that's actually a great question. And it was actually one that I'm going to go back to that first, the school experience when we were putting this framework
Mm-hmm.
in place. So back in mid 2000s, because it became crystal clear that something was missing.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, um, I would say we had great teaching staff doing good things, but in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
We all refer to it as isolated islands of excellence. And we then had what we referred to as our school support team, which included the administration, the learning support personnel here. We had a family school liaison that was part of that. And what was happening is that was the level where we were trying to provide supports for students who needed supports beyond the classroom, more than
Mm-hmm.
just what the classroom teacher was providing. And I would say that the school overall did a really good job for students with intensive needs that maybe needed one-to-one
Mm-hmm.
educational assistance support or paraprofessional support. But because there was nothing in the in-between, we were having a lot of students getting referred for those more intensive supports, which come
Mm-hmm.
at a financial and human resource cost,
Yep.
was a
Mm-hmm.
very expensive model to try and continue. And because there was nothing in between, we were also our teachers were referring a number of students to this team that we couldn't keep up with the overload that was coming. We were very much overwhelmed as a school support team trying to address all of those needs. And there was no more resources that were coming from our district to help support. We had to figure out a better way.
Mm-hmm.
And what was missing was building up the expertise in the classroom. There was almost in some cases, and it was a result of our systems, not our people, but
Mm-hmm.
you would have teachers who would say, I've done everything. Now it's your responsibility. Yours meaning the administration, learning support
Mm-hmm.
beyond. And
Yeah.
we couldn't keep up. We needed something else. And to do that, we needed to build up the collective capacity within the school. So that was really the genesis of this collaborative response work, because we were referring far too many students for what would be in a traditional RTI or MTSS structure, the tier 3
Mm-hmm.
uh, supports, and it just was not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
So
just
that I can think of a number of different ways I can go with that as far as just questions. I might come back because I know we're going to get to some of these questions later as we talk about the framework, but I'd love to talk about the micro versus the macro, or people issues versus systems issues, because a lot of the people who might be listening and some of the people that I work with, so clinicians, again, a lot of them are that support staff, and they see themselves as, I'm the person who gets referrals when students need special education services, which of course that is a big part of their role. And what I do for people is help them to create, have good systems for themselves as an individual so that they can have the capacity to start to think about other bigger systems issues. So not just their own systems, but how is the school functioning, so that they can start to advocate to their leadership for trainings, especially if they are running into capacity issues. Because you can't, if there are things going on in the classroom and those people are getting all kinds of referrals, obviously that is hard to keep up with, as you mentioned. So how do you think about people issues versus systems issues? And then I'd love to get into some specific examples of what does that mean? Like, what do systems issues mean and how do we go about addressing it?
Yeah. So let's start first with that people versus systems. It's been my experience, and I'm in general an optimistic person. I
Mm-hmm.
believe that every person does the absolute best that they know how to do in order to
Right.
help you succeed. Like, you have
Mm-hmm.
to start from that premise. If
Yep.
we go on the premise that, well, no, only 80% of educators or whatever role you want to put in are what we would consider effective, the others are ineffective, that's the wrong mindset to go about. I firmly believe everyone does the best that they know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
Where we need systems in place is, how do we ensure that people are consistently growing, learning, and building their toolkits? And this is very much part of the collaborative response framework, is it's systems that get in place so that everyone's growing at through the process and learning. So that, for instance, let's use a really specific example. Let's say I'm in a teacher in my classroom and I have a student with some speech difficulties. And I put in my referral to be able to have a speech language pathologist to come and observe and then give me some strategies to be able to work through. I put in that referral, and again, depends on the system that's in place, but maybe that takes 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 8 weeks to be able to be serviced. The SLP then comes in and does the observation and suggests, here's some different strategies that you could utilize. We're going to build up a little bit of a plan for that. Well, that's a really expensive model to be able to do it in my classroom. And now 3 months later, there's someone in my classroom next door who, similar type of concern that comes up. But as the SLPs put plans and shown me as a teacher how to be able to support that student. What if we could in the school create systems then that when that situation pops up in another classroom within the school, maybe the first level of response is me as the teacher who's learned from this SLP with some more advanced strategies or skills. What if I was the first person to be able to say, this looks similar to something that I've had experience with? Here's what I was told in that situation to be able to do. And we talk about in our collaborative response framework over time, building out this continuum of supports, which becomes our
Mm-hmm.
collective toolbox. Or
Yeah.
we often hear people say, everyone has a toolbox. We're creating a tool shed where all of these
Mm-hmm.
strategies and ideas are here. So there's things that we could try where, let's say that we have 10 students that in the past we would have been referring. Well, maybe now we are referring 6 because the other 4 are seeing success with the strategies that we're trying just from the capacity that we've built in-house. That's what I'm talking about when it comes to systems versus people. If we do it on an individual person basis, it's going to overwhelm our caseloads, our supports, the resources that we have for more intensive supports. But through these systems that we can put in place, we can ensure that in time, less students are needing that referral, or actually more importantly, the students who absolutely need to have that referral, because I'm sure you've seen in your experience, and I've seen it over and over and over again, of sometimes the service providers becoming in time or not in time could potentially become frustrated with going, oh, I don't know why this is being referred. If this person only put in these few simple strategies, this probably wouldn't be an issue that
Mm-hmm.
that has escalated to the level that it's gotten to now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And sometimes the way that I phrase it is asset stacking, like instead of
Yeah.
trying to individually create lesson plans for each individual student that you have, even again, even if it's the SLP or the OT or the social worker, stacking what you have for yourself, but really taking that idea and saying, okay, you don't just have to have this as your own toolkit. This can be something where it's almost like a toolbox that others can use. And that's, one of the biggest challenges that therapists have is I don't have time to train the teacher. But if you think of it like, here's something that I can create to share with you that you can learn this strategy. So now if you have another student that comes along and needs support, or if this specific student that you're working with needs support beyond whatever this scenario is, you can use it again without me having to come into your classroom. Not that we're trying to avoid coming into classrooms altogether, because of course it's really important for those related service providers to be in there and be participants and all of that, but just from the efficiency standpoint. And I like the idea of thinking about universal supports, because I think one of the biggest objections that some of the support staff get when it's, why aren't teachers providing more supports in their classroom, is that it feels like something else on their plate. But if it's something that can be woven into their practice or their system, it doesn't feel like an extra thing. It just feels like this is the continuum that I offer in my classroom, and these are my habits. So,
Well, and this is where within our collaborative response framework, we talk about 3 foundational components. One being this continuum
mhm,
where we want to continue to build this continuum of supports that is school-based, for exactly what you were talking about of that asset stacking
mhm,
type idea, or this reference that we could say, but have we tried this, or
mhm,
this strategy? We then also talk about utilizing data and evidence, but
mhm.
most importantly, the most important foundational component is having layers of team meeting structures so
Yeah.
that there's regular opportunities for me to be expressing. And, you as a colleague could be saying, well, have you ever tried this in your room? Or let's say someone suggests, have you ever utilized a fidget tool with this student? And I say, I don't find fidget tools work at all. I find they're more of a distraction than positive, for then another colleague to say, oh, well, I find them useful. Let me tell you how I do that in my room. And again, it just opens up that ability so that all of these, when you say, people feeling overwhelmed,
Hmm.
it's just being able to see how could this exist within my classroom, within my processes that I have in place. And it may just be another colleague explaining this is how I've done it for me to be able to go, oh, I get it. That's doable for me. I think I can make that work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think where we could potentially go next with even just thinking about the system is the meeting structure. And I know
Yeah.
that when you talk about meetings, it's like, oh, I don't want to go to more meetings. But when you create the structure for the right meetings with a very focused agenda, you can actually get a lot done and it can be more efficient over time and more effective. So can you talk about, I know that there's different puzzle pieces in the model as far as how the framework works together. I guess maybe start there with what are the pieces, and then we can talk about the big one where we talk about what do the meetings look like, who's
Yeah.
meeting and when, and all of
Let's
that.
go right to it. So the meeting structures are really important, and we talk about it within layers. And
Mm-hmm.
I can address your first frustration, and we hear this often too of, ugh, another
Mm-hmm.
meeting. I would argue that if you put people who are wanting the best for students, are well-intentioned into good meeting structures,
Yep.
don't hear that anymore.
Right.
I don't think people get frustrated with meetings. I think they get frustrated with ineffective or unproductive
Yeah,
meetings.
absolutely.
Often show that if we can structure and put together really thoughtful processes, we have people that crave these meetings. And we found that in our own school. When I transitioned out as an administrator, an incoming administrator was asking each staff member, what do you appreciate? What would you look to change? And across the board, the appreciation or the please don't change the meetings that we have set up. They're really, really important for us. So let's go to the layers. And
Yeah.
I'm going to just not go in order. We talk about 4 layers of team, and 3 of these layers are not going to be that unfamiliar for schools because they're going to start to align with 4 tiers on our continuum of supports. And I'll talk a little bit later about why 4 instead of the traditional
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 4 layers of team that we talk about is a collaborative planning team is the first, and it is going to connect to tier 1 when we talk about it a little later. The second is a collaborative team meeting, which will connect to tier 2. The third is a school support team, which will go to tier 3. And then the fourth type of meeting is a case consult, which will go to tier 4. So I'm going to start from the top and work back a little bit.
Okay.
Case consult, every school since the beginning of time or the introduction of external service providers have always had case consults. We basically refer to this as anytime we're meeting about one student and the right people are being brought around the table. So it may be that I have Micah, who we need to look at some more intensive supports. We're going to get all the people who need to be part of the Micah conversation, one student. Now, if that was the only type of meeting that we had, it would be insanely inefficient in a
Mm-hmm.
school. A school of
Yep.
2,000 students would grind to a halt. There's no way you could do that one kid at a time. But you and I and everyone listening knows there are times absolutely where we do have to have a student about or a conversation about this one child. Okay, so that's the first, the more intensive layer, and it's going to connect when I talk about what are tier 4 level supports, because this is a conversation where we're probably investigating what are tier 4 level supports we should be putting in place. Usually it's because we've either exhausted or already put in a strong foundation of the other tiers of support. Okay, the next one down that'll relate to tier 3, and again, I'll come back to the tiers, is the school support team. So this already existed within my own school. It involved the administration, our learning support, that family school liaison. We would meet once a week to look at who are students that are needing supports beyond the classroom, still within the school. At this point, we're not necessarily looking at external services yet or divisional supports or anything, but just what could we do in-house? For my school, this team met weekly. We met every week. In time, we had a referral system that would bring which students need to come forward. And like I said, before we brought in these other layers, this team was overwhelmed within my school. We just couldn't keep
Mm-hmm.
up with it. But we often refer to this team becomes a bit of the hub. It's the hub of saying, do we need to go back and look at the classroom practice, or do we need to move this forward to look at a referral for more supports beyond? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to intentionally skip the collaborative team meeting, which is the second, and go down to the first, which we refer to as collaborative planning. And the reason we use that is it's a fairly broad term to say anytime teachers are coming together on a regular basis to plan, not necessarily talking about individual students, but cohorts overall. Most schools, if they have any type of PLC or professional learning community structures, it would fit into this layer. The idea that we're talking about curriculum, assessment, we might be looking at our data and determining, okay, our data is suggesting there's a large number of students with these literacy needs, so we're going to do this professional learning together, or we're going to build some units together to address. The intention is in the collaborative planning, we're building up universal classroom practices that are going to impact all students. Okay, so lots and lots and lots of schools have the 3 meetings I just described. And we had them as well, not to the same degree of effectiveness that we would suggest now, but they were there in some manner. But what we were finding is sometimes in the collaborative planning, it wasn't necessarily being responsive to what was being seen in the classroom. So I'll give you a great example. We had a grade 1 team one year that was working on developing some really effective writing practices. They were using common prompts, doing some writing samples. They were coming and collectively examining them, marking them, and then making groups of students for what kind of skills they needed. But when you looked at our data, our writing wasn't actually the number one thing that was being seen as a barrier. It was executive functioning that was happening. If you spent any time in the classrooms, you would see executive functioning was, and it was what teachers were coming to us at the school support team with concerns around. That should have been some of the work they were doing in their collaborative planning, is helping to support that. And then on the school support team, like I mentioned, we were getting overwhelmed. So we introduced this layer of team that we referred to as the collaborative team meeting. And it had a very specific structure and purpose, but the idea was, how could we address some of the needs before they reach the school support team, or could inform, at our collaborative team meeting, we've had this issue come up several times. We should probably take it back to our collaborative planning time and work out some plans around that, or get some professional learning, or do something to increase our capacity. So those 4 layers of team become really important, and what they look like in schools is very, very varied. It's varied depending on their configurations, their size. Often say collaboratively plan with people you share a teaching assignment with. So oftentimes in high schools, this is happening by subject disciplines. You have your English department that's meeting on a regular basis, your science department that is meeting. But when we come to collaborative team meetings, in elementary schools, it's usually by grade level, or the grade 1, 2 teachers are a team. But then when it comes to the collaborative team meeting, we try and mix people around so that we're creating multiple networks of collaboration happening in the school. So I might be meeting in that collaborative team meeting with 3 other teachers that I don't normally collaborate with in my collaborative planning time. So that becomes really important over time as we're trying to build up everybody's capacity. And again, building that collaborative culture that in time it becomes really comfortable for people to say, I don't know how to do this. And it's not as a deflection. It's okay. Yeah. So let's figure out how to do this. What could we do?
We're going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. Do we have the right plan in place to make sure that educators and therapists and administrators can pool their resources and create assets that can be used in various ways to support students? One of the most important things to think about when it comes to collaborative teaming is how you're going to support students' executive functioning. And as a subject matter expert, you can be a huge asset in this process. So, one of the things that you want to consider is if you have the right intervention in place when you have those students in your direct sessions, but also you want to think about how can I take what I'm doing in there and use that to train and coach others. That's exactly what I help you do in the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Do you ever have people who float between different kinds of meetings? Like maybe they don't always attend this meeting, but maybe they attend sometimes. I'm
Yeah.
just curious with that flexibility because just thinking about different service providers, how maybe they're typically providing those individualized services for students, but they could provide some input on what could happen in the classroom. But maybe they don't have capacity to be there all the time, or maybe they don't need to be there all the time because they can share some information or whatever it is.
You
Or,
bet.
yeah, go
So
ahead.
I'm going to send to you, and maybe we can attach it in the show notes here, a blog that talks about these layers of team, and it'll also
Mhm.
talk a little bit about who's involved. So if we
Yeah,
went those 4 layers from tier 1 up to tier 4, and again, I haven't explained the tiers yet, we'll come to that.
yeah.
So at the first level of collaborative planning, we say this is teachers primarily. Every
Hmm.
teacher is part of a collaborative planning. Now, as a administrator, I'm not involved in those conversations. I set structures for it so that it's well utilized time, and we talk about creation of team goals that they're working on. I come in to support when needed, but I'm
Hmm.
not a regular contributor. Our special education individuals are not regularly involved in those meetings unless invited in, and typically our service providers are not part of that collaborative planning unless we've determined that the grade 1 team overall are struggling with this universal concern and need a little bit of PD around it.
Hmm.
Now, in the collaborative team meeting, we typically say we want 3 to 5 teachers involved in that, but then we need an administrator. We want our learning support personnel or special education team. So if we think about this through a general slash special
Hmm.
education, we want our general education teachers in that and our special education because we're learning from one another. And we
Right.
often talk about in the collaborative team meeting, everyone's an expert and everyone's a learner. Everyone has expertise to share, but no one has this completely figured out. We all can learn from one another. And then we might in that meeting have some of the external service providers, but not typically. The school support team, then, we don't necessarily have teachers involved in because sometimes the conversation in that might be about a teacher. And what I mean by that is it might be we're discussing this student that is been referred because of these needs, but when we've done a little bit of investigation, we find out actually there's a gap in a teacher skill set. How could we help support that? Maybe back in our collaborative planning layer. And again, it's not being judgmental or evaluative. It's just
Hmm.
what is the need and how do we address it? So in the school support team, we have administration, school administration, our special education personnel. That might be where we say a referral has come in and we want to connect with a service provider, or maybe an action from this is this person is going to talk with Dr. Karen to share, and then next week bring back some suggestions or ideas that we
Hmm.
could do. Then the case consult layer is where this is absolutely where we want the external service providers coming in. We often say this is the layer where we might have parents or guardians become involved in the conversation. It would almost always have the teacher involved. If there's a paraprofessional that's working with that particular student, they'd be involved. But in those conversations, when we're developing out plans, you're trying to build the capacity of the people in those rooms that then filters down through those other team meeting layers. So let's say, for instance, you are coming in to work specifically with student Joshua, and you've created a plan, you've shown the teacher how to do this. as the learning support or special education team, they've been involved in it. But then what we hope through those other three layers is the learning that they've done through that gets proliferated outward, so that it doesn't mean that we're never going to need service providers. Of course we will need that as external expertise coming in, but everybody else's capacity is growing through this process and this system. So that's typically what it would look like. We
Yeah.
often say that the teacher's involvement, the focus on classroom instruction becomes reduced as we move up those layers, because as we get up increasing intensity on those layers of teams, the conversation might become more and more about things other than classroom instruction. And the conversation about the student intensifies as it goes up those layers of team. Where at collaborative planning, we're not looking at individual students necessarily, but by the case consult, we absolutely are. And we often say in that second layer, the collaborative team meeting, and I'd like to talk about that in just a little bit about the process that's really critically important in that meeting. We actually say in that meeting, the story of the student is problematic. It interferes the process, but when we get to the case consult, we need the story of the student. We need to understand what's the home situation, what's worked in the past, what hasn't. Is there a sibling that has similar concerns that we've addressed before in the past? We often say the story of the student becomes intensified as we move upwards.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is the case consult, is that different than special education services or IEP meetings?
No, and when we say the case consult, it's basically an overarching category for whenever we're talking about one student. So absolutely, an IEP program planning or review would be considered in that category. And lots of schools have multiple types of meetings that fit into that category. But until you look at your school through these 4 layers, I've done this with a large high school once who had really good structures in place for students, but when they held it up against these 4 layers, they went, oh my goodness, most of our meeting structures would fall into that case consult layer. And that completely explains why we're feeling overwhelmed, exhausted. It feels like we're putting out fires all the time.
Yeah.
So that's why those layers become really important to understand, and then to think about where in our school would each of the things that we do, where would it fit? And almost always the collaborative team meeting layer, the second, is what's missing. It's what's unique in collaborative response versus RTI. In RTI structures, or response to intervention, they would have typically the case consult, the school support team, and the collaborative planning in place.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Is that you normally have the IEP meeting, like most schools have that. And then most schools have some kind of mechanism where the department or the grade level is meeting together. And then you always have it was called the problem solving team, where where I used to work, and we would talk about individual students, but it was a lot of times it wasn't special ed yet. So it was somewhere in between, but we didn't have the other layers of coming together to create a toolbox and talking about the classroom, even though we were doing some PD and we were sharing resources and things like that. It wasn't quite as structured.
This is one of the exciting things whenever schools, we first introduce this work, is they can see connections. Most schools can see, okay, we've got pieces of this, but we haven't put it all together in the way that's being suggested through this framework.
So what makes sense next? Should we talk about meeting structure or the tiers?
I think the tiers would make sense, and then the collaborative team meeting is probably the thing that listeners would be most interested in.
Yeah. All right, let's do that. Let's talk about the tiers.
The tiers. I am a huge proponent of the idea that schools have to stop tiering kids. Stop tiering kids, tier the supports instead. The idea that there is no such thing as a tier 3 student. There's a student who may need tier 3 supports in this particular area. So when we talk about a continuum of supports, we promote the idea of 4 tiers. And the 4 tiers are this. Tier 1 being, universal practices that we would expect to see in every classroom. And we used to, early when we began this work, we called this part of the framework a pyramid of interventions because it was consistent with some of the PLC languaging at that time and some of the RTI literature that was starting to emerge at that point. But we found out that a pyramid worked when you tiered kids, but in time, we shifted to tiering supports, and then a pyramid didn't work because at tier 1, we don't want to say there's 100 things we expect every teacher to do in every room. We come up in time in our school with the non-negotiables, the big rocks. So let's say, for instance, your school has said executive functioning is an area of growth that we are trying to achieve in our school. It's something that we've recognized as a need. Our data is suggesting it, and it's something we want to work on. Then one of the first things we say is start developing a continuum related to executive functioning. So we could see schools in time have multiple continuums built out in different areas. So when we started with first developing a literacy continuum. And at tier 1, we put out we typically say 5 to 10. In time, coming up with 5 to 10 non-negotiables we expect to see in every classroom in relation to the area of focus, which for us was literacy at the time. So for instance, something at tier 1 might be, we expect daily engagement in reading practice for students. Students have to be reading daily. Okay, how you do that in your classroom is different than how I might do it, but we expect everyone to do that. So tier 1 usually takes some time and lots of conversation to be able to get to. And the idea with our continuum is it's never finished because we're learning. We may find out 2 years from now that our tier 1, we were missing a really foundational researched practice that needs to become part of how we just do business in this. So that's tier 1. Tier 2 becomes the supports put in place for some students, some of the time, in some classrooms, but still under the direction of the classroom teacher. So for instance, we may have said, I'll go back to my use of fidget tools. We may not have said that at tier 1, every student has the opportunity to access a fidget tool. We might not be there as a school, but at tier 2, we could definitely put down fidget tools are a possible strategy or resource you could use in your classroom. Okay. Usually tier 2 becomes a large list of things that we could be trying or possibly considering. Tier 3 then become the supports provided by someone within the school, but beyond the classroom teacher, by someone other than the classroom teacher. So for instance, we may have a speech language assistant that we have in our school who is taking small groups of students in the afternoon under the direction of an SLP who is helping to design some of the programming. That might be a tier 3 support that's available in the school. Then tier 4 become the supports provided by someone external to the school. So it may be maybe there's a small group that is, or a one-to-one support that is being provided by an occupational therapist, let's say, who comes in. And this is why we often say tier the supports, not the students, because this particular child might need tier 4 supports at this point in time, at this stage of their development, but that tier 4 support may be in place for a short time. The teacher learns how to do it, and then it might become a tier 2 level support because now the teacher can do that with fidelity and clarity. So by intentionally naming and articulating the things on our continuum, then when we come into our meetings and I bring up that I have this student and I have this concern, we turn to our continuum and say, have you tried this? Have we tried this? What would this look like if we put in place? And we often say then, especially to those external service providers who have vast expertise, to be able to look at our continuum and say, is there anything we're missing? Is there things that we could be trying before it ever gets escalated to you? Or, you know, we have on our continuum this one strategy, but our teachers aren't really sure how to do it well. Maybe we need some PD on it. And the creation of that continuum then becomes hugely impactful, not just in discussions, but as a teacher, when I'm struggling with a student, I should go to the continuum and say, is there things I could try here? And if there's something on there that I don't know how to do that, it in time shouldn't be a badge of shame that I wear because I don't know how to do it. It should be, who do I need to find to show me how to get this done? It's on our continuum. It means somebody in our school is doing this well to get it on there. So it's really trying to create a anchor resource that is constantly being refined and updated on an ongoing basis.
It's the interesting thing is that people do this on their own. Good teachers, like you said, what did you call them? The isolated silos of excellence, or yeah, that teachers do that, but
100%.
I'm sure the pool gets a lot bigger when you pull your resources together and everybody's contributing to it. So
100%. And when it's written down and you say, Kurtis, have you ever tried this? You're not saying it in an evaluative manner or a judgmental. It makes conversations about practice safe because it's on our continuum. I'm only asking because it's there. These are ideas that we can suggest, and it doesn't happen right away through this work, but we find over time when the culture becomes much more about collaboration, that continuum becomes hugely powerful because people, when I suggest something to you, I know that you're suggesting it because you're not judging me as an individual, but it's on our continuum. It makes it safe.
Yeah.
So then
the meeting. Yeah.
Let's get then to the collaborative team meeting.
Yeah.
And in every one of those meeting structures, we talk about things, common sense things like really purposeful agendas, time set out, roles. These are all things that we over and over.
Good meeting practices for any organization, not even just 100%. Schools.
100%.
Yeah.
Collaborative team meeting is special. So this is what it looks like. You heard me say before, 3 to 5 teachers, and then some of our additional staff members are involved in it. As a principal, I might attend depending on, well, in my school, I had 7 collaborative teams that were team meetings that were set up. Every teacher was involved in one. I attended all 7 of them. Our learning support teacher did as well within our school. In other schools, it looks different, of course. But every teacher would be involved in one. So here's what it would look like. We would say, all right, this meeting is focused. The overarching theme is numeracy, because that's something we've been working on. So teachers, come ready with a student that you'd like to talk about. Now, when we first start, it's, just a student that I'm noticing this concern in relation to numeracy. In time, we want the data to start surfacing so that when I looked at my data, this student came forward. And in time, we don't want the collaborative team meeting to be about our most intensive needs students because they're already being discussed in one of our more intensive level meetings, like the school support team or the case consult. This is how all these pieces start to work together in time. So I come in and we always start a collaborative team meeting with celebrations. So you would say, I'd like to celebrate Jocelyn. And since the last time we met, she's been doing amazing at self-talk. I'm seeing her start to utilize self-talk more effectively in the classroom. Now, this is where the facilitator of the meeting has a really critical role to play when we turn during that celebrations and say, why do you think that is? What did you do that led to that increase of self-talk? And the teacher being able to say, well, I've been modeling it more and more overall for the class. And when I see her doing it, I'm really being specific in my praise. Okay. So we would spend, let's say, 10 minutes on celebrations going around in that. We find the celebrations part to be hugely impactful because not only is it reinforcing that we're making a difference, but people are hearing strategies, hearing things that are working. Somebody saying, oh, I could be modeling self-talk a little more in my classroom. I should be doing that some more. It might even be after the meeting. I'm coming to you after school to say, can you tell me some more about how you did that self-talk thing? I'm really interested because I've got 3 kids. I think that would help. Okay. So then from that, when we move into the next part, we focus on key issues. And this is what it looks like. And it's radically different. It looks like you're talking about kids, but you're not. You're using it as a mechanism to talk about practice. So I would turn to you and say, Karen, who's a student you've brought? And 30 seconds or less, what's a key issue that you're experiencing in relation to numeracy? Okay. And you go, I have Jackson, and my key issue is applying the mental math strategies that we've been teaching in the room. He can tell me all about doubling as a strategy. He can tell me about rearranging as a strategy, but I'm not seeing him put it in place in practice. Now, we might in the room ask a couple questions like, do you think it's a language concern that they're not getting it? Do you think that it's that it's memory recall?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want to spend too much time talking about specifically about Jackson. It's just to get clarity around the key issue. So when we get to, okay, the key issue is application of mental math strategies, specifically this particular strategy. Then we want to very quickly say, okay, who other teachers, what are the names of students, just names of students who you're also experiencing this. And what we're trying to do is get the attention off Jackson as the individual student and off Karen as the individual teacher. So we're going to say, okay, I have one in my room. Someone else is going to say, I've got two just like that. And then we say, okay, what could we do for addressing the key issue of application of mental math strategies? Go. And we just start brainstorming. And during this time, there's no evaluation. Nobody's turning and saying, Karen, you know something you could try for Jackson? If I was a facilitator in that case, I'd say, whoa, we're not talking about Jackson or Karen here. Just throw out the ideas. And this is where we turn to our continuum and say, is there anything on our continuum that we should be considering or suggesting? So we do that brainstorming, and we often find in that brainstorming, there's people taking notes themselves because they've just heard of a good idea. Or when you jump in and say, I've been utilizing this particular song to help remind students of this, and I go, oh, I make note of that song. I'm going to have to check that out, find out where that is. We do that brainstorming, and then we come back and say, okay, Karen, for Jackson, what's one thing that you're going to try as a result? And you say, I really like Kurtis's idea of using anchor charts in the room. I haven't done that. I think I can do that. And then we say, okay, we'll put that down as an action for you. When do you think you could have that done by? Would that be fair to say by the end of next week? And we put the date on it. And then we turn to the next teacher and say, okay, for the student you identified, what's one thing you want to try? And sometimes we might all try the same thing. Sometimes you might try something because you know it's going to work for Jackson, and I'm going to try something because I know it's going to work for the student in my classroom. But we all walk away with something to try. But you'll notice in that, we didn't spend a ton of time talking about Jackson. We tried to focus on the issue and then just opened up toolboxes. And then from that, we might go, man, there's 3 really good ideas on that list. We should add them to our continuum so that they're available the next time we meet together. And it's through that collaborative team meeting that everybody's capacity just keeps growing and growing and growing. I walk out of that with a new website that I hadn't heard of, the way a teacher is doing anchor charts in their room. I had never thought about doing that. And this person's been teaching 3 doors down from me for 10 years, and I had no idea they were using that strategy in their room. It happens all the time.
I think the thing that is different and where I've seen meetings go astray is the almost the venting. Like I can think of so many times I walked into a teacher's room thinking, I need to touch base with this teacher. I need to get a question answered. We need to come up with a plan for, a specific student typically, and that it ends up just you're rehashing and re-explaining your same frustrations that you've been talking about for weeks. And you almost start ruminating, and the idea of, okay, we're just going to report on what's happening, and then we're going to shift to problem solving mode and think about what are our strategies that we have, and shifting the focus off both of the people who, again, that, like you said, the teacher, the student. It's just, what is the goal here collectively, and what can we do to look at our options? And then we bring back again.
And this is why our layers of team then become so critical, because when you turn to me and say, who's a student in a key issue? And I say, well, I have Bryn, but oh, there's so many things going on. We say, okay, we're not going to talk about Bryn here. Should we schedule
Mm-hmm.
what would be in that case consult layer?
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to schedule a meeting about just Bryn to really break this down? But lots of times we find out that schools who didn't have this were having the one person meeting, but they didn't need to because sometimes the similar concern was coming up in
Mm-hmm.
different places.
Yeah.
It becomes really, really powerful. And then sometimes someone might suggest a strategy and we go, oh boy, that's interesting. We're going to take that back to our collaborative planning and work on that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lots of good
So
stuff. Lots of, I think even just the smallest shift in the way that you handle a meeting is, or even just having someone who's a facilitator with a very clear goal. And I think that that is, even though some of the examples that you've given may be different based on the way a school is structured, based on who is an external provider versus who is employed by the school, when you know the purpose of the meeting, that can help you determine who needs to be there and how it's going to be structured for your school or your district.
yeah, and the role of the facilitator becomes really important. We spend a fair bit of time talking about how you structure that meeting and then
Mm-hmm.
how you lead and facilitate that meeting. And then in time, we see schools where they come in and say, all right, who wants to facilitate today? Because it's just become natural.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we could go,
Yeah.
I'll facilitate today. I'll take that on.
Yeah. Love it. Well,
Doesn't
where can
happen.
people go to learn more about the collaborative response or just some of the services and resources that you offer?
I would say the best place would be to go to our website, which is jigsawlearning.ca. On there, there's connections to lots of resources, free webinars. We run an annual retreat related to this work. We have lots of different products. Our book is available as well on the website. The website's the best place to probably launch from, and it has all of my contact info there, as well as my wife, Lorna, who also engages in this work with schools all over.
Great. Well, we'll link to all that. Thank you so much for being here today.
Perfect. Thanks. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for links to all the resources mentioned in this episode. And also be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put programming in place to support students' executive functioning. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As always, it helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Spotify, or somewhere else. And if you have a suggestion for a guest, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you would like to invite me to collaborate and be a guest on your show, you can email me at talktomeme@drkarenspeech.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with a friend or a colleague. And as always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next time.